I want to tell you a few things for those of you who are new to the Science Gateways Community Institute. I'd like to share a little bit about what we do. And in recognition of the fact that today is a topic of communicating with your audience, I thought I'd give a new try at how I talk about our organization and make it even briefer, hopefully. So we have services in 3 different areas. This one main area is support for building and running gateways, and that includes various kinds of consulting, both hands-on as well as advice, and also we provide a catalog of gateways and software that are there as a reference collection for anybody interested in looking for ideas or components. Our second main area of services is education and training, and that includes this webinar series. Also, our Science Gateways boot camps, which happen twice a year as sponsored by us, and then we've had some other special ones for specific audiences. We also have a number of student-focused programs. Our annual conference, which will be upcoming in September of 2019 in San Diego, and then also a variety of website resources and materials. And then our third main area is the opportunity to network and connect with this larger community. Some of the ways that we do this is through our partner program, which helps people find out about resources and communities that are related to the Gateway community, as does the affiliates program, which helps connect you with software support. And we also on our website have things like blog news and job postings, and we have a new community forum. And again, obviously the annual conference is not just for learning, but also for connecting with other people. So these 3 together are supported by 5 different service areas within our institute, and as you dive into these different resources that we can provide to you, you'll come in contact with different members of our teams. So with that, I just want to make a quick plea to, if you can, take a moment at the end of this webinar to give us feedback. We'll be posting this link also on the chat area to make it easy for you, and Elyse also has said that she would love to get feedback about anything she can do to make this a more robust presentation. So with that, I'm going to let Elyse take over with her slides, and I'd like to introduce Elyse Aurbach, who works here at the University of Michigan. I'm totally excited to have her here today presenting because she presented a keynote at our 2017 conference here in Ann Arbor, and her expertise comes from having spent a bunch of time developing and delivering training programs for scientists who want to better communicate with their audiences. And this is incredibly relevant to the Gateways community, and we're really excited to be able to capture her advice here for more people to enjoy. So with that, Elyse, take it away.
Thanks so much, Catherine. So I'm really pleased to be back to reprise my keynote from 2017, and it sounds like it's actually quite timely, so I hope that you'll be able to apply some of what we talk about today to the supercomputing conference that's coming up next week. So I'd like to start with a maxim that I've heard a lot, especially as a scientist. So Catherine mentioned this, but I'm a neuroscientist by training, and so in addition to thinking about communication and public engagement, I've interacted with a lot of professionals in STEM, including a lot of developers. And there's a phenomenon, an idea around the canonical line from Field of Dreams: if you build it, they will come. And what I mean by that is that people seem to inhabit this idea, or this space where if they have an idea, they build a thing to instantiate that great idea and to create something to make the world a better place, and then they publish it, then they're done. And the idea of trying to communicate that work is just the act of publishing it. Once it's out there, it's good, people will find it, they will use it, it will be great. And usually the opportunity to try and think about when one publishes and what one publishes is around the questions about functionality and quality. Nobody really wants to publish something that they'll be embarrassed about, and so that makes a lot of sense. But what I would argue, and what I'm going to argue today, is that the finish line might be a little bit further away. So how, might you ask, does this apply to supercomputing? How, might you ask, does this apply to science gateways? And before we get there, I want to take just a minute and reflect on that question from a naive user's experience. So I am a scientist. I am not a gateway developer. I don't actually use a lot of gateways. And so when I was approached for the speaking opportunity initially, I had to ask myself the question really pretty straightforwardly, well, what's a gateway? And so in preparing my remarks for last year's conference and also for this webinar, I, as many good scientists do, pulled out my laptop and I got to work. And one of the things that I started doing is I started poking through a number of different popular and successful gateways, some at the recommendation of Nairi and Catherine, who are hosting this series. And when I look at these sites as a communications professional, I noticed a huge amount of variation in a lot of different fundamental aspects of communication, including graphic design. Some of them have incredibly elegant designs, some of them less so. There's a huge amount of variation in what the gateway is intended to do and who the audience is. There's a huge amount of variation in what it seems like the approach to talking about this information is, how clear it is, how clear the use cases for the gateway are. And even just the idea of whether or not there was something like a 2-sentence tagline to explain the function and purpose of the gateway was really, really heterogeneous. And so to synthesize what I mean by this, from a communications professional perspective, I really just see a lot of heterogeneity, and heterogeneity specifically in these core elements of foundational communication. So I'd like to dig into this even just a little bit further, and I'm doing this not by virtue of trying to pick on any one gateway website, but rather just as an illustrative exercise to think about what a naive person might look like, or what a naive person might experience when visiting a gateway for the first time. So the gateway websites that I looked through really had a lot of variance in the way that they seemed to be targeted to different audiences. Some of them did a really great job in trying to tailor their experiences for people who hadn't necessarily had any access or previous experience with that gateway before, where others are more assuming that there is a degree of expertise in what that gateway is used for and how it might be applied. Similarly, there is variance in what the purpose of the gateway seemed to be. So for instance, gateways around citizen science seemed to be really much more about trying to draw in potential users. But there were also gateways that were really highly specialized and intended to share specific bits of code or that kind of thing that could be used in specific applications. And similarly, it seems like there were also opportunities sometimes to better and worse degrees where the gateway seemed to be for the purpose of probably fulfilling some kind of a requirement that the information or the tool be made publicly accessible. There also seems to be a lot of variation in content, and the content of the website is mostly the public-facing communication pieces of it, and so there was a lot of variation in how explicitly the content of the website articulated things like the need or the application or the unique list. And what I mean by these things are, for instance, the problem that the gateway solves, the approach that the gateway uses to solve that problem, how it's different from other tools, and how it actually works. And those communication pieces were really variant across all of my different examples. And finally, there was also a lot of variance in context. And so while all of the gateways that I looked through were websites or online portals in nature, I understand that there to be opportunities to think about the communication or about the way that we communicate about gateways in lots of other places, including how we talk about them at professional meetings, on lists or through listservs or on social media. And so I really want to pause for a minute and highlight this idea that variance isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it means that you've got really shining examples in among some of the more opaque or confusing communication strategies. But I think that it's important to ask the question where that comes from. And I'm going to put forward a hypothesis that It really comes from this phenomenon, this idea that once you publish the gateway, once you publish the work, that you're done. And my assertion here is that I think that that's only part of it, and that we should actually probably think about that finish line a little bit further down the road, and to think specifically about what a communication strategy is around that gateway to make sure that potential users are able to connect with it and to use it as effectively as possible. So I am going to make the assumption that as gateway developers and users, you want the gateway that you're working with to be successful. And so let's pick apart and examine that assumption just a little bit. What does that mean? What does success look like? When I talk to many developers, frequently what they mean with a gateway being successful is that it's functional, it works well, it gets cited and used, and that it has links, that it's sustainably supported, so that it doesn't just get built and ignored and then everybody moves on with their lives. And what I'm going to ask you to do is potentially start thinking about the design of your communication strategy, flipping away from this developer-centric perspective and more to a user-centric perspective. In other words, start thinking about what might be useful to users, because users are generally going to be approaching gateways with questions in mind about things like how can they use this tool to accomplish something that they want to do. And so what defines that successful communication effort with a gateway user is really much more about how easy it is to find the gateway, how easy it is to navigate and apply the gateway to specific types of tasks. It's much less about the function of the gateway and much more about the way that the user is able to interface with it to put it to that good use. I think that the key idea here is that we have to try and think a little bit beyond ourselves. We're all by nature fairly egocentric. That's perfectly normal. It's human nature. But with regards to communication strategy, it's not particularly helpful. And so when we're thinking about communication strategies, I'm going to encourage you to empathize with your user base, to empathize with your audience, and to apply this principle, to design based on the way that people are, not how we wish that they were. So where people are, we want to meet them where we are, not expect them to come to us. And I would argue that if you do this, you can adapt your communication approach, your communication strategy, and that will actually have a huge impact on how successful the gateway is over the long term. Okay, so great. You say, I hear you, Elyse. You're telling me to adopt a user-centric communication strategy. When I get there, I will be able to cross the finish line. My gateway will be A-okay. Everything will be happy-dandy. How? So the rest of this talk and the bulk of what I'm going to be talking about today is really about the fundamental mechanics of how communication works and the types of things that I would argue you should be paying attention to in order to have an effective user-centric communication strategy. The key idea that I'd really like to hammer home around all of the things that we're going to be talking about today with communication skills is that it's not just about things like the language that you use or the design elements that you incorporate into your website. You have to focus on the core elements, the invisible elements of the communication strategy in order to be successful. And in that way, it's kind of like the foundation of a house. So you can imagine that if you build a really strong, stable, well-packed earth foundation, that it'll last your house for 100 years. And the subsequent walls and windows and doors and roofs and paint and window dressing and furniture will all have a much more stable place to live if and only if that foundation is built with a huge amount of integrity. And the same thing is true when you're thinking about building a communication strategy. Just that the foundation elements are really specific. And I'm going to argue, at least for the purposes of this part of the talk, that there are three: your audience, the goals, and the core message. So we'll take these in turn. Before we start going through them, I think I want to pause for just a second and argue that part of why it's important to focus on these invisible elements is that they're decisions that you make around communication strategy that are incredibly high impact. If you think about an audience and misjudge your audience of your gateway, then you're going to potentially be doing an awful lot of work to tailor the way that you communicate with them and to be creating a strategy that's not appropriate for the audience that's actually showing up. And similarly with the goals, Similarly with the message. And so it's important to spend a lot of time thinking carefully about the way that each of these is going to work for your particular use case and your particular user base. And that if you do this, you get a really, really high return on investment. And if you think about it in the context of the lifespan of the development process of your gateway, it's actually not going to take you that much time to do even a really in-depth discovery process. And so I'm going to argue that these are things that you should think about carefully because they don't take that much time, but they have a huge, huge payoff. So let's dive into each one of these specifically in detail. And let's start, as all good communicators do, with the audience. Now, the number one rule of all communication efforts, regardless of context, regardless of audience, regardless of forum, regardless of means, is that you have to know your audience and to communicate for their benefit. Again, this comes back to this idea that we're trying to decentralize ourselves from the communication effort and centralize our audience and to try and do the work to meet their needs. It's not about us, it's about them. So in order to learn about an audience, you have to do a degree of discovery, right? And so the types of questions you might want to ask include, what context are you communicating in? How many people are there going to be? How similar are they going to be? So you can imagine how the communication effort that you might eventually end up crafting would be different if you're writing work, if you're speaking in person, or if you're using some kind of a media-based strategy to get your word out. You can also imagine that if you're speaking to a few highly specialized individuals, that's going to be really, really different if you've got a big group of people and you're unsure about what kinds of backgrounds they have. And similarly, it's going to be really different if you have a highly homogeneous group of people who all have similar bases of knowledge and similar expectations versus if you have a big mix. These are really important elements of discovery that really help to shape the way that you construct a communication strategy. And so you have to be thoughtful about attending to them. Similarly, you have to ask yourself about what brought them there. We're all busy, busy people, and we all have lots of different types of motivations and presses for our time. And so to the best extent that you can empathize with what brought your gateway's audience to that website, the better extent that you'll be able to craft a communication strategy that will help them to accomplish their goals. We'll come back to this in just a minute. You'll also want to ask a lot about what their background, knowledge, and expertise is, and to think carefully about what assumptions you can safely make. And before I get too far into this, I want to pause and highlight a really, really big pitfall, which is the curse of knowledge. So I'm going to make the educated guess that I'm speaking to a fairly highly educated group of people who work with gateways. Seems pretty reasonable. We are in a gateways-focused webinar environment. Now, the curse of knowledge is fundamentally about forgetting what it's like to not know all of the things that you know. So for you as a community of gateways people, this would be like forgetting what it's like to not know what a gateway is, or to not know all of the elements of the particular gateway that you've developed or been a part of developing. Forgetting what it's like to know all of the science or all of the engineering or all of the coding behind that gateway and all of its potential use cases. And that forgetting means that you've fundamentally lost track of a degree of empathy. And it's one of the easiest places where you can lose an audience because you're misassuming what people know. If I was in a classroom right now, I'd ask you all to raise your hands to ask if you've had the experience of sitting in something like a seminar talk and listening to somebody speak about something that you just feel like you have no access to because they're using a lot of jargon, they skimmed all over through the background, that type of thing. And what's fundamentally happening in those experiences is this: it's the curse of knowledge. It's assuming that you're much farther down a road of learning than you already are. And so as a communicator, when you're thinking about crafting a communication strategy, you have to be really careful to make sure that you don't fall into this pitfall. Okay, so in addition to that, these types of discovery processes shape what kinds of vocabulary and word choices that you use. And so it's important to educate yourself about what the points of shared vocabulary are. I'm going to make the educated guess that if I use the word jargon, that most people will know what I'm talking about. Jargon are neologisms, words that were invented for a particular use to accurately and concisely communicate with a high degree of precision. And the problem with using a lot of jargon in gateways is that if you misjudge your audience, if you fall victim to this curse of knowledge, then you might be trying to reference ideas that people haven't learned the vocabulary in order to be able to access. And so I'm going to ask you, especially if you're thinking about a gateway that might apply to a broader audience or have a really heterogeneous group of users, to think through the lens of translation. Almost everyone is smart enough to be able to understand an idea, but it's not always true that everyone has had the opportunity to learn the specialized vocabulary that you, as an expert in whatever your gateway is about, have had the opportunity to learn. And so if you adopt this frame that it's fundamentally your job as a communicator to make sure that you provide access to ideas, it will help you an awful lot. And you use all of this discovery process, everything, to start making choices. It's not enough to think about what your audience might use if you never put that knowledge into action to try and tailor your communication efforts. And so that's why we start with audience and why we start with the idea of discovery, because it's the type of information, the data collection, that you'll use to make all of the deliberate, thoughtful decisions over the course of your communication effort in constructing the visual look and design of your website and all of the content, everything to tailor your effort. So, hopefully we've gotten through why you should care about your audience and some of the core elements of what you should care about with your audience. And so now let's talk about what we want to accomplish. Before we get too far, I want to highlight the idea that the idea of being goal aligned is something that gets used in lots and lots of different places. And I'm going to leverage this idea of a commander's intent to try and articulate why being concrete about a goal is really important. So commander's intent is an idea that was popularized by the US military over its long and storied career, but described most recently in a book called Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. And the idea of commander's intent is that at the top of every military order, the commander who's issuing the order to the subordinate puts effectively a one-sentence goal to articulate the core ideas of what that commander wants the person to accomplish. And so that means that the person who's taking that order, who's trying to implement that order on the battlefield, has a line of sight through where they want that command, or the commander wants them to, or what the commander wants them to do, so that when things go toes up with a battle in unpredictable circumstances, they at least know how to orient. So if the commander's intent is go take that hill and defend it against all enemies, regardless of whether or not the enemy is trying to swarm over a river or if the enemy ends up being redirected to a different place, the person who has received that order knows that their job is to make sure that their battalion captures that hill. And so even if some of their guys get wounded or something along those lines, they know that that's what their job is. And there's an analog here in communication. It's important to be thoughtful and specific and constructive in developing a goal so that you know exactly what you're trying to do. This will help with your prioritization process because you have to be able to establish what you want to accomplish in order to be able to craft the core elements of your communication strategy to get there. But that's not enough, unfortunately. So we are all independent actors, which means that it's not enough for me as a speaker or as a communicator to say, this is what I want to accomplish and have it work. The thing is that your audience or your users of your website are going to come in with goals of their own. And you can imagine with, or I can imagine with a Gateway's audience, that the types of goals that they might want to walk in with are things like learning or exploring something new, especially for something like a citizen science portal. You could imagine for more of a specialist gateway that the researcher might be looking to apply research to a problem or to find a valuable resource that could inform the way that they're conducting their work. And so the question becomes, if we have speaker goals and audience goals, are they aligned? And I am going to argue that effective communication happens if and only if speaker goals and audience goals align. And I want to pause for just a minute and note that I'm using speaker and audience for a broad communication positioning issue. So speaker is the person sending the information, audience is the person receiving the information. This applies regardless. It could just as well be crafter of audience content, receiver of audience content. The point here, though, is that this idea of alignment of the goals is really critical, because it's not going to be helpful if your user base is coming to your website to try and help crunch through some interesting citizen science data, and what you're trying to do is share an algorithm around nanotechnology. Those are fundamentally different goals, and they're going to go head to head. So you need to think about your audience, think about what's going to bring them there, and then consider if that is actually a really good action item to try and think about how you might use that information to craft your goals. How can you shape your goals to meet their need, not hope that the people who show up will be aligned with what you want to do? Okay. Talked about goals, now let's talk about messaging. So messaging is critically important, and it's mostly critically important because it helps receivers of information to focus. Now, think about even just an online environment. So I don't know about you, but before I shut down all of my browsers to eliminate notifications to make sure that this webinar could proceed uninterrupted, I have, I have different windows with probably an average of 11 different tabs. I had 2 different email browsers open. That's before and instant messaging, that's before my phone. There's an awful lot of content, even just in the realm of my internet browsers, that's pulling my attention in different places. And what that means for a communicator is that we have an awful lot of work to do to try and make sure that when somebody engages with our content, that we're capturing their focus and their attention appropriately, and that it's aligned with what we're trying to accomplish and what they're trying to accomplish by coming and visiting us. So in other words, the core goal of having a central idea, a central message, of being thoughtful about crafting messages, is to ensure this degree of focus. Before I move on, I want to make a note, because I'm going to be talking about communications efforts as a whole, and for the purposes of a gateway, think about the unit as a web page. So each individual page should have one message, just like the way that I'm going to refer to communications efforts as a whole, having a specific single message. The reason why this is important is because an entire website that has many different nested pages can't just have one single message. So think about the unit as one page, not the entire site architecture. I'm going to argue that for the sake of simplicity and for the sake of clarity, defining one central message is actually really key. And that sounds like a lot, but the thing that I'm not trying to do is emphasize, or I'm trying not to do, is say that you're trying to oversimplify or dumb down or reduce the ability to communicate information. The question is more about prioritization and thinking about the types of information that are really necessary for your audience and to meet the goals. And the metaphor that I think is the most valuable here is something that's attributed to Michelangelo, who is attributed with saying that every block of stone has a statue inside of it, and it's the task of the sculptor to discover it. And in much the same way, every communicator has blocks and blocks of ideas, especially people who have a lot of expertise for a specific type of subject content. There's lots of information there. And so the core goal of the messaging process is to try and figure out what is the single most important idea and how the other ideas relate to it, so that you can establish a prioritization process about what to include and what to take away. Fortunately, there's a great tool that I'll own. I have a little bit of a conflict of interest in touting, but I'll tell you about it anyway. Called Half-Life Your Message, that will help you to try and establish your central message for a communication effort. So Half-Life Your Message is an adapted improv game. It's one of my very favorite tools in the world for a couple of reasons. 1, it's short. 2, it's highly effective. And 3, after you've done it a couple of times and have sort of lost your anxiety about it, it's actually kind of a lot of fun to do. So the way Half-Life works is like this. You talk unprepared, without stopping for 60 seconds. No more, no less. You talk about the idea that you're trying to communicate and try and make sure that it's appropriate for the audience and the context that you're communicating about. So in the context, for instance, of a web page for a gateway, you would talk about the content of that web page that's in a manner that's appropriate for that audience and in the context of where that web page is going to be housed and how it's going to connect to other pages. Immediately after that 60 seconds is done, you repeat the same ideas, but here's the catch. You only have half the time. You have 30 seconds, not 60. And then immediately after you finish the 30-second iteration, you do it again in 15, and then finally immediately in 8. And by the time most people hit their 8-second version of their message, they've stripped away all of the unnecessary ideas to really get at that core, to get at the heart, to get at the single crystallized idea that is really the genesis of how they're going to prioritize information to communicate around that message for that context. Now, I want to pause for just a minute and say, the idea of stripping everything down doesn't mean that you're trying to dumb ideas down. So Einstein is known to have said everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And so the idea here is that you're trying to prioritize and strip down to the very, very core elements of an idea so that you can articulate it. And once you can articulate it, that means that you can be thoughtful about adding additional layers of detail back in to make sure that the appropriate level of context is there and that it's aligned with the goal and aligned with the audience. And so, in other words, you're stripping your messaging strategy all the way down to the very, very barest bones, and then you're going to be building it back up again with your goal and your audience in mind. Okay, so we've gotten through the 3 foundational communication skills. So great, we're all set, right? Well, not so much. So the thing about building foundations is that you still have to build the rest of the house, right? And in the context of a communication effort, the rest of the house are things like the language that you might use and the design features that you might develop. And the argument here is not that these things are unimportant. They're incredibly important. It's just that you'll be much better equipped to think about how you might want to develop the shape and the size and the form and the feel of these things, if and when you've figured out your audience, your goal, and your message. I want to articulate before we move on too much also that this is a skill set that you can develop, and anyone can develop these skills. So at this point, I've been teaching communication skills for coming up on a decade, and I've worked with communicators across the map, across the spectrum. People who are already fairly naturally communicating, if they work on these invisible foundational skills, get better. And people who are less good at communicating, who maybe struggle, when they work on these things, it's amazing to see the leaps and bounds that they make. But this is a process. What that means is that communication iterates. So you're going to have to take a process of drafting, securing constructive and effective feedback, revising, and then iterating on that process. Draft, get feedback, revise. Draft, get feedback, revise, until you get something that you feel is really strong, and the feedback that you receive from your colleagues or from your intended audience also communicates is really strong. So in part because we're going to be, or you are going to be attending a conference soon, I also want to take a minute and articulate how all of these recommendations apply beyond science gateways. These are foundational communication skills, which means that they apply in all kinds of different circumstances. And I'd like to be really explicit about it, in part because I think that it's a really great avenue for professional development. One thing that I want to make clear for this next little bit is that it's important also to think about the difference between short form communication and long form communication, especially as we start talking about another element of communication, which is storytelling and narrative. Short form communication, what I mean by that is content or content that's delivered in sort of a short, small, bite-sized package. So it's things like the content of the web page content above the fold. It is the 30-second elevator pitch that you might give when you're meeting somebody for the first time. And so in short form content, the message and the way that it's constructed and the delivery have to all be right on, because you only have just that one shot to get it before you lose people's interests and they move on. Long form communication, or things that take longer or have a little bit more space to them, comes with different types of risks, because with more time, you can communicate more information. And the tug there is that when you communicate more information and can have the ability to communicate more details, you have many, many, many more opportunities to lose people. And I can imagine that since many of you are likely associated with academia in some capacity, if you think back to any one of these single types of communication experiences, you can probably come up with an example in your personal lives and your personal experiences of where somebody just totally lost you in any one of these communication contexts. And so in order to avoid that, I'd like to actually focus on a fourth foundational skill, which is storytelling. Storytelling is really also a foundational skill. It's not as simple as audience goals and messaging, but narrative applies much, much more, and it matters an awful lot more in long-form communication than it does in short-form communication. And while people have literally spent years teaching storytelling and have entire semester-long classes based on these mechanics, I want to give you a couple of functional suggestions off the bat to try and help jumpstart any communication efforts that you might be working on. The core issue with the way that most scientists, most STEM professionals, even most developers tell stories is that they speak in what we call and loops. I am a scientist, and I study the brain, and the brain is composed of circuits, and circuits are regulated by a class of molecules called growth factors, and some of these growth factors are really important in illnesses like major depression, and. And the problem with and loops is that they don't preference information in any kind of meaningful way. It's basically all equally weighted information that is probably put together in some kind of a logical form, but it's really, really difficult for people to follow, and it's really, really difficult for people to understand what to attend to. They're not going to remember every point, and so what are they going to remember? And that's really the crux of why communicating this way is not a great idea, is that it's really difficult for people to focus on what they're supposed to be taking away from that experience. And so the answer to this is storytelling. And the reason that stories are powerful is because throughout all of human history, stories have been used as vehicles to deliver messages. The whole point of a fable is to tell a story to articulate why a core moral value is important. And most stories serve this function in some capacity. I would argue that there are two really necessary qualities for a good story. Number one, your audience has to understand it. So any logical leaps or any inaccessible language is going to mean that your audience disengages because they don't follow. And your audience has to care. So in other words, there has to be some kind of an emotional investment, even just at the level of curiosity, in order for to be good and for people to want to continue to follow you through it. For the purposes of today's conversation, I'm going to highlight three specific types of narrative structures, which are the key vehicle to trying to address that first quality, to make stories understandable. Those three are the and, but, therefore story structure, the hourglass, and the Hollywood swoop. And I'll highlight that the hourglass and the Hollywood swoop, if you've seen a Hollywood movie or if you've read an academic paper or a grant, you're already familiar with these story structures. So let's start with the new one. So the and, but, therefore structure is a structure that was popularized by a scientist termed documentary filmmaker by the name of Randy Olson. And the fundamental idea here is that most science stories and many stories in general can actually be broken down into 4 component parts. And even if you combine 2 of those component parts around the and, then you'll actually be able to get it down to 3. So most science stories can be told in the following way. This was known and this was known, but this wasn't known, therefore we studied it. Almost any science story and almost any gateway story can be told this way. It's about articulating the context, what already exists, showing the gap, and then articulating the solution that addresses the gap. It's really, really straightforward. There are also ways of leveraging the ABT story structure to tell the answer. So like, we studied this and so this is what we found, or we built this and this is what it does. And if you're interested in that, I strongly recommend that you pursue Randy's books. The second story structure, the hourglass structure, is, like I said, the fundamental basis of most grants, especially NIH or NSF style grants, as well as most academic papers. And the idea is that the x-axis is about the breadth of what you're talking about at any given time, and the y-axis from top to bottom is progression through time. And so the idea is that you start broad, narrow in progressively more and more and more until you're talking about the very specifics of what it is that you're doing before broadening out again and attaching it to the real world. So if I were talking about, for instance, my research during graduate school, I might talk about how depression is an illness that impacts thousands of people in the world, and that studying the neural basis of depression is really critical in order to develop new therapies, before getting into the specifics of my research, which really had to do with a class of molecules which impacted circuit function. And this was important because the way that those really had a large impact in the way that people felt. And then I would talk about the results that I might find, and then attach it back to how these results might have implications for developing antidepressant drugs. So we start really, really broad to contextualize lots of opportunities for people to come and join you in the discussion of the work, get more and more and more and more specific to the context and the specific elements of the work, and then broaden back at the real world scenario. The third structure, the hourglass structure, is really Storytelling 101, and almost all Hollywood stories leverage it. So I'm just going to go through it in the abstract and ask you the next time you watch a Hollywood movie to think to yourself what phase of the story you're in. Almost all the stories start with some kind of a contextualization piece where you get to know the characters, you try and understand a little bit more about the context in which the story is happening, and then there is an inciting incident. So in other words, something happens to disrupt equilibrium, and then tension builds and builds and builds and builds and builds until you hit a climax point, at which point things start to resolve themselves, and the story, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, ends with the protagonists or the characters in some kind of a better shape than they were before. And if you flip that story swoop on its head, you get the very characteristic progression through storytelling that you probably all learned in high school. And this is really the key to narrative tension. In other words, the second element of how to make a compelling story. So the idea is that if you have progression through time on the x-axis, the core element or the core idea behind a story structure is that you're varying tension such that sometimes it's low and sometimes that it's high. And most characteristic story structures have an extended period of building a lot of tension up until you hit the climax point, at which point tension starts to release and you finally end with a satisfying denouement. And the question that you'll have to address for the purposes of your audience, for your gateway, for your talk, for your poster, is not what's compelling to you, not what is interesting and most compelling and will drive the most narrative tension from your perspective, but what it is for your audience. Before I end my discussion about communication, I really want to make a plea to practice these skills. Do try. Do ask for feedback, and do make a commitment to spending a decent amount of time on them. These things are skills that are like muscles. You have to practice them, you have to exercise them, you have to work them in order for them to get strong. And I'll make specific types of pleas for different types of people. So if there are PIs, principal investigators on the call, then please help your students to focus on these as a core aspect of their professional development. And focus on it yourself too. Like everyone, regardless of their skill level, has the ability to improve, which is actually why I asked Catherine to solicit a request for feedback, because I also always have room to improve. And trainees, I really want to focus on personal goal. It's incredibly important for your professional development, and it doesn't matter what career trajectory you're going to follow. You're going to need to be able to communicate, and these core skills are things that apply regardless of context, regardless of environment, regardless of audience, regardless of what you're actually trying to communicate. It matters that you can communicate. So work on it. I'd like to highlight two specific resources before ending our discussion and starting to take calls. One is the organization that Catherine referenced at the beginning of the call. So I co-founded and for a long time co-directed a science communication and public engagement organization called Relate here at the University of Michigan. If you're interested in learning about our pedagogy model or with connecting with the current leadership of Relate, I encourage you to visit the website at learntorelate.org. And if you're away from the University of Michigan and can't take advantage of the really great resources provided by Relate, while I was still a core member of Relate, we actually built a bunch of the pedagogy into a free online learning event called Stand Up for Science, Practical Approaches to Discussing Science That Matters. And so these core aspects of communication, thinking about audience, thinking about goals, thinking about messaging, thinking about narrative, and how they apply to different types of audiences was something that we specifically developed into an online learning experience, and it's freely accessible to this day. So with that, I'd like to end on my central message for this communication effort, which is please, please, please focus on the invisible elements, the foundational elements of your communication skills, and I can guarantee you that if you work on those skills and practice them and don't neglect them, your communication effort will be that much more successful. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Elyse. you're welcome to keep your slide up, or I can put my one up there. Why don't I do that? But so far we don't have any questions that popped up during. I think they like me, they're probably all just paying attention to what was going on. So I will now welcome folks if they have any questions for Elyse, and you can pipe up. Also, by the way, I am keeping track of all of the different things, useful resources that Elyse mentioned during the presentation, and I dug up your article as well. So
Oh, great.
yeah, because I was like, oh, I have to read that. So anyway, we will be sending when we post this online. Also, we'll post the link.
Thank you.
That article. Yeah, I see that it was just officially published in October, although it came out in June, so that's very exciting. So I'm gonna share my screen. Just looking here to see if anybody has posted a question yet. Not yet. So I'm gonna let you guys see my screen. So I have put a link to the webinar evaluation in the chat, so do give us feedback if you have to leave before the end of the hour or at the end. So while we're waiting for other people to come up with questions, I did have a question for you, and maybe I just missed it because I was just, my brain isn't as fast as yours. But I'm wondering, how do you decide which of those different story structures do you should use? Because you gave those 3 different examples, and the ABT one I'm familiar with from the book, but I'm curious, like, when you would choose to use some of the others.
So it depends a lot on the context. So the way, if I'm writing for an academic audience, then I almost always will naturally gravitate towards an hourglass structure, in part because that's what's expected, and in part because that's generally what is going to fit in things like the requirements for the grant or for the paper. But I actually use an and, but, therefore organizing structure, almost all of the time, especially when I'm trying to think about the sequencing of information. And so the and, but, therefores can actually be strung together sort of one after another. So you can use it on a micro scale in addition to a macro scale. And so, like, for instance, I'm writing a working report for some people who are less familiar with the work that I'm doing in my current role with the Office of Academic Innovation. And I realized pretty quickly that even though it's not an academic report, I was actually leveraging an and, but, therefore structure in effectively an hourglass format. So I think that what I'm trying to say here is that they're not mutually exclusive. The choices that I make generally tend to rely on the types of expectations that my audience is going to be bringing to the table. And so, for instance, like, I might choose to use more of a Hollywood structure if I'm communicating in a science cafe at a bar, because that's going to be more entertaining, more edutaining than, which is in line with what that audience will expect. So it always comes back to what the audience is expecting to get out of it, what will be most effective and most beneficial for them.
Terrific, thanks. There has been a question posted from Jill, who said, thank you, this is so helpful. It strikes me that the half-life, your message exercise might be helpful when developing vision and mission statements. Have you ever used it for that purpose?
So yes, and for vision and mission statements, actually, there's a tweak on the half-life, your message exercise that can actually be used in teams. Which is to start with actually a much longer period of time, which is like start with like 15 minutes and envision like something like an 8-word structure that you're trying to get to, or like a 15-word structure that you're trying to get to in those 15 minutes. And then do the same thing in 8 minutes and 8 words, and then the same thing in 4 minutes and 4 words with a small group of people. And the reason that ends up helping is that it's not just an individual exercise the way that the 60, 30, 15, 8-second versions are, and it enables a lot more collaborative conversation while still emphasizing the core elements of half-life your message, which is rapid iteration, a rapid and immediate iteration. So yes, it makes a lot of sense. I've also very successfully deployed half-life in thinking about learning objectives for courses, so that's another really good use of the exercise.
Cool, thanks. She says, awesome, thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Yeah. Um, no other questions have popped up just yet. Um, So what I'm going to do for a moment, while we see if any other questions come up, I'm going to just make a pitch for our next session, which I think will follow really well from this one, the webinar that you see described here. So it's about identifying your competition, and in particular, the very beginning of it is going to talk about recognizing who your audience is, and as a way of recognizing how they think about what your competition might be, essentially, because it would reflect where they're going to look for comparable products elsewhere. So that's coming up December 12th, which is the second Wednesday of December. There are no events in that week that will make us change our date. So I just do hope that you guys will consider joining us for that, which will, of course, be recorded as well. So with that, let's see here. I am looking to see if there are any more questions. There are not.
Yeah, Catherine, this is Nancy. I don't have a question, but just a comment. Wanted to thank Elyse for taking the time to join our webinar with some really timely information. And it struck me, I knew you were saying this during the presentation, that it's helpful for, sort of our SC style presentations, but it's also important for proposals, getting that message across. And I think especially for gateway developers, because sometimes you're getting reviewed by a mixed set of reviewers. So you have technology experts and then domain science experts. And it's really important to be able to tell that story in a way that everybody can consume it, especially for gateways, because you're not just talking to people who really understand in depth the science. So really helpful message. I immediately thought about, where we can put this information on the website, kind of, communication resources for gateway PIs or something like that. I'm sure we'll be working with Catherine on that if she doesn't have things up there already. But yeah, really timely, and thank you for taking the time again.
Sure thing. Great points, Nancy.
Well, since nobody else is chiming in with any questions, I'm going to say, hey, we get an extra 5 minutes in our day. I think it was very clear. So I want to thank you again, Elyse, for sharing your insights a second time with us, because I think this is just so valuable for folks to be able to refer back to